Frankie, a question for you. Luke, I think, is indulgently but dubiously ready to give this a try, but your opinion matters too.
Oh.
I've got this PowerPoint that I'm sharing that will just automatically advance after the timings that we've set and give us big red warnings when we've got 1 or 2 minutes left, depending on whether it's a 5-minute or a 10-minute notional segment. Do you want to try that, or do you want to say that's a delusion?
Well, I mean, I think I'm glad it's you that's proposing to use this, because I feel like of the three of us, it's probably you and me that are the most at risk of ignoring such a device. So, like, I'm willing to give it a red hot go. And then we can always laugh about it later on when, like, our screens just go into meltdown at the 2-hour mark. Like, what
His PowerPoint will self-destruct after 3 hours.
What happens after it gets to the 45-minute mark? Do we get increasingly irate, like, memes start flashing up on screen?
Clippy will appear and say, "You appear to be attempting to end this podcast. Would you like help?"
And I'll say, yes, please, please. This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and for our first episode of 2023, I'm delighted to be joined by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm a little bit nasal, but I am so delighted to be back with the two of you for this podcast. And I'm on Gadigal land, Aboriginal land, always was, always will be.
All right, and a man whose PowerPoint superpowers are exceeded only by his excellence in Excel, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Bold claims. I think there are people who understand Visual Basic out there who are sneering at me through the ether waves of podcasting. They know I'm not half the office user they are.
On this week's show, we embark on a possibly ill-considered attempt to cover all the big news from January by summing up both the Safeguard Mechanism design paper and Professor Ian Chubb's review into Australian carbon credit units. But first, long-time listeners will know that Tennant is a man of many interests and enthusiasms, but few of them have burned as bright as his passion for carbon border adjustment mechanisms. This previously obscure piece of policy has rocketed into prominence as the government's Safeguard Mechanism design paper commits to a review of whether a CBAM is something Australia should implement. Now, we're about to discuss this paper in detail, but I couldn't let this milestone pass. Tennant, you literally wrote the report on CBAMs and their implications for Australia. How are you feeling?
Oh, look, I'm a little bit excited about this. It's pretty exciting to see something that has been your personal, private, really weird obsession turn into something that became relevant and then became something that policymakers start to take a really serious look at. I have to say, I am not the only person in Australia, or even the longest standing person in Australia, with an interest in CBAMs. And I would like to pay some tribute to Jeff Carmody, the eminent economist, co-founder of Access Economics, and guy who I thought, wrongly, was a bit balmy when he was banging on about CBAMs back in 2008.
Are you using that phrase, carbon border adjustment mechanism, at that time? Or
he was.
Yeah, right.
He was. And he was talking about them in the context of his consumption-based carbon tax concept, which was very GST-ish, and saying, and you do a carbon border adjustment on top of that. And I don't think the GST thing was that great, but the CBAM, he was a far-sighted man. Of course, CBAM is something that the federal government is going to have a look at. They have rigorously not committed yet to do it, and it's a big discussion to be had, both within government and with stakeholders in Australia and internationally with our trading partners. So, you know, don't count your CBAMs before they've hatched. But it's a big step to even be looking at it.
Nonetheless, I think we should pay a special round of Let Me Sum Up tribute and congrats to your efforts in stimulating that conversation in recent times, Tennant. Bravo.
And I would further encourage our listeners to take a look at your paper. 2021, I want to say, Tennant?
2021. Yeah.
What's it called again?
Into the show notes it will go. Swings and Roundabouts, the unexpected effects of carbon border adjustments on Australia.
My abiding memory of that paper is that you made it into a cake. You were so pleased with it. And I should say, actually, if you're not prepared to go read Tennant's excellent paper, I actually, on my other podcast, did interview you on that paper. So maybe we should chuck that in the show notes as well, because
that's a great idea.
For folk that are podcast aficionados, that might be a very efficient way of getting your head around the CBAM space.
We definitely should, but we should also post a link to the photo of the cake. that deserves its moment in the sun also.
It was a good cake. It was very tasty. Sweet Forgeries make great art cakes, usually with better pictures than the clip art palooza that was on my cake.
All right, so it sounds like at least a third of our show notes this episode will be taken up with CBAM-related content, as is appropriate at this auspicious occasion. Shall we chat about a couple of reports?
Yes, we should.
I don't think we're biting off more than we can chew.
Of course not.
I think this is going to work out great.
What could possibly go wrong?
Everyone, this is the point at which you settle back for at least the next hour as we dive into our 45-minute podcast on papers.
I'll be so impressed if this only takes an hour. January 2023 saw the release of two blockbuster climate reports in Australia. On the 9th of January, the independent review of ACCUs, commonly known as the Chubb Review, after the review's chair, Professor Ian Chubb, released the results of its 6-month investigation into the integrity of Australian carbon credit units. Then on the 10th of January, the Albanese government released its proposed reforms to the safeguard mechanism, the next step in the government's efforts to retool an Abbott-era program to drive down the emissions of around 215 of Australia's biggest emitters in the middle of this year. Now, Frankie, lesser podcasts would have settled for covering just one of these reports in depth, or indeed splitting the discussion of them over 2 episodes. But as the podcast of record for Australian climate reports, it was incumbent on us to catch up on both, and they are closely interrelated. Where do you want to start?
Well, you're right to say they're intrinsically linked, and I think the Chubb Review is a good place to start with this because, you know, so much of the initial action by safeguard entities will involve consideration of ACCUs in one way or another. So why don't we dive into what Ian Chubb and his panel had to say about the integrity of that scheme. I think there was a lot of media reporting around after the election last year. Indeed, the government, this was one of the very early things the government committed to do in terms of reviews and looking at structural reform. Short, sharp review. So they commissioned Ian Chubb and the panel in July last year in 2022 and gave them only 6 months to have a pretty comprehensive look into the functioning of the scheme or the ERF and looking at not just the integrity of the methods that sit within that scheme, but also the governance and sort of transparency around how the scheme operates. Now, that didn't come out of nowhere, obviously. In recent times, there were a lot of critiques around the sort of contention that a majority of the credits that were being issued under three of the main methods, which we'll get to, did not represent real and additional abatement. So there were claims that there were sort of bad rules governing project eligibility and abatement estimation, so bad methods, and poor interpretation and implementation by the Clean Energy Regulator, who has a very significant and widespread role over the scheme as it was when it went to review. And really the root cause of a lot of those issues, the critics said, was a combination of a poor governance and a lack of transparency around the scheme. And it is important in the context of this to note, what chief among those critics was Professor Andrew McIntosh. He's a leading environmental law and policy scholar at the ANU, and he was also a chair of the Australian Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, or ERAC, the committee that oversaw the assurance of methods in the RF for a while. So he was very well placed, I think, and someone whose concerns you would take seriously when raised. So
pretty powerful when the gamekeeper says the poachers are running riot, there's no integrity in the preserve, it's a disaster. That's a powerful statement.
He was labelled a whistleblower for a while. I think people criticised that form of labelling because he had been involved in the scheme for a really long time as well. But nonetheless, it was I think a really brave thing to come out and call for change the way he did. And when I mentioned the issues with the methods not having represented real and additional abatement, the critics were mostly talking about three methods, but they're the three methods that make up over 3/4 of ACCUs generated under the ERF. That is the avoided deforestation method, the human-induced regeneration method, and the landfill gas method. And they each sit somewhere, between sort of 20 and 30% of the ACCUs generated. So, if it was found that one of those methods wasn't robust and perhaps credits associated with them shouldn't remain, that's a significant impact to the scheme. So that's the background. What's very interesting about this review is that whilst it does note those critiques, and so it definitely doesn't seek to ignore that in the commentary, it says very clearly in its findings that the panel did not share that view, that whilst they were provided with some evidence that supported that position, that abatement was being overstated or in some level wasn't being met, they also note that the panel was provided with evidence to the contrary. I'm sure we'll dive into the discussion here, but it's sort of interesting in terms of the overall findings from the panel state that by and large they thought that the settings of the scheme were sound, and then they identified some areas for improvement to improve governance, robustness and transparency and the like. But a lot of the recommendations proposed are pretty sweeping reforms to the scheme. So it's interesting to hear it characterised as this is essentially sound, but here are some rather fundamental changes to the governance and transparency of the scheme that need to happen.
You're absolutely right. The overarching finding is this is a fundamentally sound scheme, and naturally it will keep evolving and improving. And here's some recommendations for how it can evolve and improve right now. And we should say that the government has accepted in principle all of these recommendations, and some of them they're going to take a bit of work to do, some of them are going to take a bit of money to do, but so far the signal has strongly been whatever's necessary they're going to do. So the recs fall into two broad buckets. One is around the governance and transparency. So the Clean Energy Regulator had a bunch of different jobs to do, and those are going to be hived off a bit more. So the what is currently the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee will be still more independent and better resourced, and basically not just dependent on a secretariat inside the Clean Energy Regulator, and it's going to turn into the cake. So cue lots of jokes about having your cake and eating it. There will be a boost to transparency around the publication of much more information about various elements of this. And then, of course, the Clean Energy Regulator won't be the one doing the buying of offsets on behalf of the Australian government anymore. A separate body is going to do that. Maybe that'll be a job that the Department of Climate Change and Energy, Environment and Water gets, but not the regulator, being simultaneously the assurer of and regulator and the biggest buyer at the same time, which caused some people some concern. Then the other bucket is the changes to the methods. And these are a bit diverse. So on HAR, human-induced regeneration, there's several recommendations, but broadly it's transparency. Like what I took from this is if people could see what is being done more clearly, they would have more confidence in what is being done. And in particular, that action by the project proponent to take away the main inhibiting factor, the dominant factor that is preventing reforestation or regeneration on this land, what that factor is and what has been done to remove it. On avoided deforestation, they say basically, look, stop issuing any credits for this because there's been no more issuance for a while of the land clearing permits that create the potential to be credited for not using your permitted land clearing right. And on landfill gas capture, they say, look, this is still a thing worth doing. It's worth still crediting, but it's going to have an upward sloping baseline. That is, we will expect over time that more and more capture takes place just as business as usual and is not something that you get credited for doing any of.
So when it comes to the methods, I'm really interested to hear what you two think about this. Here's where I think the review falls down a little bit, whether it might be because of the limitations placed on it in terms of scope of their review and the time they had. But, a lot of the critics who had, wanted to see this review done, had put forward, evidence to suggest, particularly in methods like the human-induced regeneration method, that, were to suggest that projects were being set up in areas, effectively were already having like a decent amount of vegetation cover, and that they were contending that a lot of the reason for growth in that area had more to do with rainfall than the actual intervention or the key suppression measure tenet that you outlined. And also I think it's fair that they say if there was more transparency about what those suppression methods are, then maybe some of that critique would fall away. But, the panel talks about getting contrary evidence, but it doesn't unpack any of that in this report, really. And what's also really missed through the report is that they also commissioned the Australian Academy of Science to do, for the panel, an independent review of 4 of the methods, including the 3 that we've talked about. And on a couple of these, particularly human-induced regeneration, they do highlight a number of issues associated with the methods themselves, including, how easy it is to set credible baselines and a whole bunch of things that aren't really addressed here in terms of the recommendations, and the fact that they weren't able to look at individual projects, I think, makes it a little hard maybe to engage with some of the critiques at that granular level when all they're doing is really, sort of staying up a little bit higher at the method level. This is where this started to get a bit funny for me in terms of everything's fine, but here are some sweeping reviews in governance and transparency and of these three main methods. By the way, you can't use one of them anymore moving forward. The other one should have adjusted baselines and then not really dealing with, I think, some of the issues that have been raised in a substantial way in the actual document. I'll stop my rant, but for the whole critique about lack of transparency, you think there would have been more effort to go into a lot more detail about the critiques on both sides and really unpack that.
This is a really odd report to read, especially if you haven't been following the blow-by-blow of every in and out of the, ACCU wars, if I can put it that way, that have been taking place in Australia over the last 12 months or so. It reads like the review panel is stepping through a minefield. They don't really want to call a spade a spade. It's more likely to call a spade a tool to pierce the earth and leave dirt out of the ground.
And a tool on which there are sincerely held different views from many quarters.
Exactly right. It goes to great length not to be critical of anyone. It's not critical of the former government. It's not critical of current institutions. Importantly, I don't think it's critical of the critics, though, either. Like, it goes out of its way to say it's actually reasonable that critics have these views, but a potential reason that they have these views is because they don't have all the information. There's a lot of, and they don't say this exactly, but the vibe is people of goodwill on both sides will disagree. We understand that, their opinions are held in good faith, but we don't think the issues that they highlight are there. The problem is that they don't really make a case for why those issues aren't there in a very compelling way. And so if you're a critic of the way these methods play out, I can understand not being satisfied by this review because it doesn't. There are logic gaps and gaps of argument and evidence. It's asserted there isn't an issue, but it's not really explained why there isn't an issue. And the critiques aren't necessarily appropriately addressed or unpacked in the report. To understand the report, you really need to go and engage with the work of Professor McIntosh and his colleagues in order to even understand what the report is talking about half the time, because it doesn't sort of characterise the critiques in a fulsome way that allows you to then understand the response. It's kind of referred to obliquely throughout.
Yeah. It's
a strange read, right?
The body of the report is largely just longer versions of the recommendations. It's rare that we do a paper for this podcast and we wish it was much longer. and I'm not sure if that is the case even here, but
I wanted it to be longer.
Well, it feels like that somewhere there's a 600-page attachment to this that does go blow by blow through the stacking up of evidence and critiques and whatever. And maybe they didn't have time. Maybe they thought, because they didn't have a lot of time, maybe they thought it wouldn't be productive. Maybe they thought it would make more people unhappy. But they've just gone for the, look, here's what to do.
I mean, this panel has acknowledged that a lack of transparency around certain elements of the scheme has not served it well. And I think it would have been the right call at this particular time as well, because I think, you had a new government, a real opportunity to do the big structural reset while you can. You know, you've got a clear mandate, some clear air to have those difficult conversations with all stakeholders. My view on balance is that this review would have been received better if it had engaged more in that detail and really sought to outline the evidence on both sides and articulate a stronger rationale for why it took the reasoning it did.
One of the issues, I think, and you touched on it, Frankie, is that it didn't have the time or the ability to engage deeply in the actual data associated with real-world projects. It was operating at this sort of 30 to 40,000 foot level. And so I wasn't privy to the process. This isn't even in my area of expertise. But absent, that deep engagement with the data, it's hard to understand how they can effectively respond to a critique which is based on data that has been collected around real-world projects, right?
Well, I just think there's this... You can't tell that from this paper. It may well be that, they were presented with this evidence which might be, a comprehensive overview of data analysis across a bunch of projects that was done for them, that did kind of provide a compelling case, against some of those critiques that had been made publicly, but they don't go into that. So, I think it just comes down to not wanting to be too hard on them, because I do think they didn't have a lot of time, because there's so many methods under this scheme, and I think they had their work cut out for them in 6 months. But equally, if the task of doing the thing right might have merited a little bit more time to do this, it would have been nice to see that happen.
Well, there's one reason why the clock couldn't be stopped, which is that the settings for ACCU generation, what's going to be available, are incredibly important for the safeguard mechanism, and in a little bit we'll get into just why they're so important. And the safeguard mechanism is meant to commence in its expanded form or intensified form on 1 July 2023, which is not very far away. Sometimes you have policy processes that can work in parallel. Sometimes they've got to be in series. You need something locked down before something else can be settled. And this is one of those. So
we've been a bit critical, but there are good things about this review. I think, all the recommendations around governance are eminently sensible. Like, this is quite a significant reset in terms of the governance and the strengthening of those institutions, the review process. Over time, it seems like a lot of stuff had just been given to the CER to do, and inherently in this sort of scheme, having one entity, effectively judge, jury and executioner, when it came to ACCUs is fundamentally an issue. And there's a lot of wording in this paper around, conflicts and perception of conflicts. There is an amazing sentence which I've got to read out. In the panel's view, whatever positives may have been intended, a serious downside has been the perception that the CER has too many roles and could be, or is just thought to be, conflicted because of that range of responsibilities.
Yeah.
That's a pretty classic Chubb review line. But the point is that, the disaggregating that is healthy. And I think the other thing that occurred to me coming out of all of this is that while one could be critical of the failure to either engage deeply with what was going on in those methods, or if they have engaged deeply, as you say, Frankie, showing your homework and explaining why you've come to the conclusions that you have, that governance reform should, of its own volition, if it's successful and done well, start to resolve, remaining issues over time, because you can have a significantly strengthened review process. They have reformed the process for proposing new methods. there's a lot of talk of resourcing, and the fact that the strong implication is this whole process has been massively under-resourced under the previous regime. So there's a view that needs to be massively ramped up. So one would hope that the governance reform deals with the long tail of issues that perhaps weren't able to be resolved through this short, sharp review.
Yeah, I don't think we should understate the potential flow and impacts from these reforms, which are structural and necessary, and I think very welcome to almost all stakeholders. I don't think there was anyone disagreeing with the idea that there needed to be those separation of roles out of the CER. And for mine, I'm really interested to see what happens with the reformed ERAC in the form of cake, because. And we're going to be talking about the implications for the safeguard mechanism, but we talked about these three main methods that have been responsible for 3/4 of credits issued. One of those is going to be off the table moving forward, and the HIR method is actually due to expire in a couple of years. I don't know if it's this year or 2025.
It is this year.
So if you had a cake constituted and up and running, they are the body that will be empowered to approve or not that method moving forward. So, yeah, it's by no means a done deal.
And so the kind of volumes, and this would be a big matter for the safeguard, but not just the safeguard, the kind of volumes of domestic Australian offsets that may be issued going forward and the nature of the activities that make them up, well, it's going to shift. The landfill gas capture volumes are going to shrink over time. No more of the current avoided deforestation. Regeneration, reforestation activities, I think we're going to continue to see more of those. But there are biophysical limits on how much of that can actually take place and be sustained. They're not necessarily tight limits right now, but they're there. So more sorts of activities will be relevant in future. Offsetting is both the structure of treating something as an offset, that is, you get a credit for doing something you weren't obliged to do, and it is the kinds of activities that first avoid, then take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so, like, the long-term future of ACCUs is probably things like bioenergy with CCS or direct air capture, and maybe some continuing reforestation and regeneration. But it's not avoidance of emissions in the long term.
There's the old hobby horse of, dare I say, energy efficiency, which, Frankie and I have done a bit of work on in the past, how difficult the ARF made getting up energy efficiency projects for a whole bunch of reasons. But it goes to the point that, one of the reasons why, issues potentially can arise of this nature is if you're over-reliant on a small number of methods. You want diversity in the market as far as possible, so that if an issue arises in a particular method, or it just, it tails off over time, there's other things that can come up and enter the market, right?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the other big things to think about into the future when we're thinking about the fact we're going to be dealing with a different suite of methods is what the implications of that are for cost of these credits over time as well. You could think about the current set of measures, one's been cancelled because that's sort of no longer a case around additionality for avoided deforestation and all of that. But you could almost consider some of these things as having been the lowest hanging fruit in a way. Across the economy. And so, Luke, you're absolutely right in the fact we need to diversify the kinds of sources for this abatement. But as the whole economy is starting to have more of a focus on entities reducing their own emissions, in their own shop, and a bit less focused on trying to sell excess abatement, you can't imagine a future in which these things get cheaper. So I think I don't know if that's a good segue into our safeguard chat, but there's so much to unpack here about what the implications of the ACCU market in Australia might look like in the next 10 to 15 years and how that weighs up against, taking action in your own operations.
So we'll use that as the segue to the second report we're going to cover, which is, of course, the safeguard mechanism design paper. The first thing to say is there's a lot of background to this, and it was covered in full Technicolor back on episode 7 of, let me sum up, The Last Fire in the Forest, the episode we did with special guest Catherine Murphy. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you could pause here and go back and listen to that to turn this already long podcast into a even longer experience.
That episode is The Hobbit. This one's Lord of the Rings, but not in a cinematic sense because the Hobbit film sucked, sadly.
And that episode was great.
That episode was great.
It was.
Yes.
I think the first thing to say about this is one of the questions we asked and that paper asked, because that episode was all about the consultation paper on the safeguard reforms. Today we're talking about the government's proposed pathway forward. Is one of the questions said, well, what should the ambition of this be? What is the appropriate task that we set these 215 odd entities that are covered by the safeguard mechanism? They are responsible for about 28% of Australia's emissions. Should that task be proportional, or because they're harder to abate, be easier on them? As it turns out, the government says, well, it should be proportional. They need to take on 28% of the tasks that the government has set of 43% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, which I think is super interesting, because what does that imply? Are we all doing proportionally what we're responsible for?
Well, pro rata is a bit weird. Nobody would think, even before getting a hired gun economic modeller to take a look at it for them and come up with the answer they like, nobody would think that it's most efficient or most equitable for every divisible sector of the economy to do, quote unquote, its mathematical share. This one is a little laxer than full pro rata, because it's preserving their share of national emissions from 2020 to 2030 as national emissions go down 43%. But the target, the national target, is against 2005 emissions, and this sector's emissions have expanded substantially since 2005 because there's a lot of new facilities and they're coal mines and gas wells and LNG facilities. But it's still like limiting that sector to 100 megatons of emissions in 2030 is a big task. It's big.
But we can't consider ourselves cut off from the rest of the world in terms of how other countries are moving here, right? Part of the need to not let sort of industry fall too far behind in terms of ambition and what they do in the next 10 years is because if we fail to put some of those, movements in train, investments, big, bulky, lumpy investments that need to be made to reduce emissions in operations, we don't want to see our domestic producers put at a relative disadvantage in terms of the global economy. So, we do need to start shifting these sectors. So, for mine, it made sense to pitch the ambition where they did. I thought it was really good.
I think it sounds fair. I think that has a lot to do with it, right? When you're explaining this policy, you're doing your fair share, right? And that, whatever the other arguments, and I'm sure there was deeper thought put into it, has that attraction as a number.
The fact that there is a number, like an absolute number, that is going to be the targeted emissions for this sector, and everything is going to have to add up towards that number, like that drives everything else. And a lot of other decisions, elements of policy design, are constrained by that number. And if one bit of the design gets more generous to somebody who doesn't like that setting, that entails that another bit of it gets less generous to somebody else or to the same facility. So it becomes a bit zero-sum because, like, the sum's got to be 100 megatons of emissions in 2030 for these facilities.
And that's including new entrants, right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, they're proposed to be treated slightly differently when it comes to the setting of baselines, and that's also significant in the design here that the government's proposing. Should we talk about baselines a little bit?
My favourite word. Almost. Not as good as border adjustment mechanism, but go on, Frankie.
So, when it came to baselines, there were a few different design options on the table, and I think there were proponents for both retaining the existing sort of production adjusted, like an intensity baseline framework, and then there were others that I think supported, and I think perhaps this has been more generous, a fixed baseline setting, but the government has settled on retaining that sort of intensity baseline framework. That's because it allows for baselines to grow and fall a bit with production, because I think we can expect that some facilities might grow in a given year or, open up new production lines and things like that. So they wanted to keep that flexibility within the design of the baseline.
And also that means that you can't hit your target by offshoring some of your production.
Yeah.
Or it's much less attractive to do so.
Yeah.
The argument that some stakeholders made was that, well, we've got a fixed task, and so there should be a fixed baseline. We've just got to, draw a line in the sand. But the government felt like, it was possible to achieve a fixed target with a production adjusted baseline, and one of the ways that they sort of built in that wriggle room, what was the word they used for it was the reserve,
It's a
right?
reserve.
A buffer.
Yeah.
And a reserve, yep.
So they're going to basically hold back some of the overall budget that Tennant was talking about. Like, we have a number that the whole sector needs to stick to by 2030. So they're going to hold that back, and that'll be spread across, all facilities, and that would take into account any uncertainty about new facilities that might be coming online before 2030. We talked about production growth being higher than might be expected at existing ones, as well as, there's sort of differential decline rate for emissions-intensive trade-exposed facilities that, might have special provisions around them. So all that's notionally catered for in having a reserve. And when we talk about the kinds of baselines that are proposed to be introduced, they're looking to implement a hybrid approach of both industry average benchmarks and then site-specific baselines, with the intention to transition more towards, or entirely actually, to industry average benchmarks by 2030 by weighting the two of them. So every facility is going to have their new site-specific baseline, calculated off more recent data. I think they need to use the last 4 years of data, and they're going to pick the middle 2 years to calculate what the baseline should be. So it's sort of removing the highest and the lowest.
Emissions George is an outlier and shall not be counted.
Exactly.
Is an obscure reference.
And then I think there was an example provided in the paper when they talk about that hybrid approach over time with the weightings. So, 2023, maybe 10%, of the weighting would be towards the industry average benchmark, and 90% of that would be a site-specific one. And that's slowly changing over the decade. And by the time you get to 29, 30, 100% of that weighting would be more in the industry average benchmark and not the site-specific one. So that seems to be a kind of reasonable and bit of a compromised kind of position in terms of transitioning the industry away from focusing on calculating site-specific baselines and working towards, everyone being compared against the same benchmark within a given industry.
I think you're right. I thought it was a pretty smart way to get where they wanted to be, which was the industry average baselines, which have a lot of advantages. It means a really clear level playing field everyone's working to. It encourages production at less carbon-intensive facilities, but going straight to them would have been immediately created winners and losers, without any sort of capacity in a very short time frame to kind of adjust how you're doing your production. So knowing you're going to them gives people time to work towards that. I just wondered whether you needed 7 years to make that transition. I'll be interested to hear someone explain why they decided that it was 7 years as opposed to 4 years or 5 years. Like given that industry average is a great place to be, it strikes me that getting there sooner rather than later would have been good. 2030 is a nice round number. I just wonder if there was any rationale beyond, it's a little way away, and it gives people time to adjust.
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind here is that this is a distributional question, not a question of the total achievement of the scheme. Like the scheme is going to be made to achieve the 100 megatons. The totality of baselines, like the factor that baselines are multiplied against, goes down by 4.9 percentage points per annum for anybody who is not trade exposed baseline adjusted, which is going to be very few. And so this is just a matter of within any given industry, who does a little better and who does a little worse. That said, I think the government just tried to split the difference. They had a very sharply divided industry stakeholders, maybe correlated with whether people would be below average or above average. And they also a circumstance where if you did have industry averages from day one, you would be crediting a bunch of facilities for doing better than a baseline, but they were like doing better on day one without doing anything new. And is that reflecting decisions that they made in the past to be deliberately more carbon intensive, or is it reflecting quirks of geology? People would argue about that stuff, and there'd be a flow of safeguard mechanism credits from the start back and forth without any additional net abatement beyond the 4.9 percentage points being contributed to. So hybrid, takes a little more effort to spreadsheet it, but seems fine.
And it is significant that that's the approach they've taken, because the result of that is that there are a lot less SMCs floating around.
Yeah, which is a big deal, because so if you think about what the scheme requires, for any one site, if what was required was that every site would reduce its emissions within its boundaries by 4.9 percentage points per year, an awful lot of sites wouldn't be able to do that, or would be able to maybe do that on an average basis over a longer period, but not necessarily in any given year. So the rules around flexibility, what are the options that you have to comply when your physical options directly within your facility may not match what's asked of you, are quite important. And on paper, there's a lot of those options, but in practice, the overwhelmingly most important option, at least in the early years of the scheme, is that there is legally unlimited access to the use of Australian carbon credit units, the ACCUs from the carbon farming initiative that the Chubb review was having a look at. They can be used to acquit liability to an unlimited degree as long as you can get them out there in the marketplace. There's other forms. Safeguard mechanism credits issued for doing better than baseline probably will be very significant in the longer term, but there's not going to be many of them around for a little while, not just because of the fact that the baseline's a hybrid, but also because implementing the kind of transformational investments that would send a facility well below its baseline and generate a large volume of SMCs is just going to take a while. There may be some sites that are in a position to go for broke early on. Most are at least going to take a little while, and some don't reckon that they're commercial options are practical until the 2030s. We'll see what people do when there's an immediate strong financial incentive to do whatever they can. And then there's other stuff. There's like borrowing some of your baseline from future years, but there's a 10% interest rate on that. There's multi-year monitoring, but there's some tight limits on access to that probably make it pretty small. So really, ACCUs are the major source of flexibility in the near term.
And government have set a cap on how much that would cost in terms of compliance. So
soft cap.
A soft cap, but what the government's said in this design proposal is that they would sell government-held ACCUs at a fixed price of $75 a tonne and, increasing with CPI plus a couple of percent. But that's effectively setting a little bit of a ceiling on the price people might pay in the next little while. Yeah, I mean, look, I am aware of lots of companies that have internal prices on carbon that are higher than that. I guess the calculus that's interesting for me in all of this, because international offsets are not on the table in the first instance.
Not at this time. Yeah.
They've noted that, there were a lot of stakeholders that would like access to high quality international offsets, and they've sort of said that they'll have a look at that and they'll, see what changes might be made to amending legislation. But as the three of us have talked at length about in previous episodes around Article 6 and the machinations at COP, all of those rules are still being worked out. So that's not a viable option. So when it comes down to it, even though there's, in theory, unlimited access to the ACCU market to meet these obligations, is there going to be sufficient quantity for all these 215 facilities to access in the volumes they might want? And at a cost that's, that's reasonable compared to the big lumpy investments that need to be made in terms of reforming their own operations. I think that's a fascinating dynamic that's going to play out in the next little while.
So the government certainly reckons that there's going to be enough out there that prices for ACCUs, they will rise, but they won't hit its cap. If prices do hit its cap, then it's got a stream of units to sell off. That's not an unlimited stream, but it's pretty big. So I guess we'll see. But how it plays out is very important because of the things that people out there, some people have expressed worry about the safeguard mechanism. One of the big things they've expressed worry about is unlimited access to ACCUs and whether that's going to mean that people don't do anything internal ever.
One of those people would be me.
Yeah.
Some people, Luke.
Some people. I feel not entirely comfortable with unlimited access to ACCUs because I feel like it doesn't provide enough incentive for companies to take a really good hard look at the opportunities within their own operations, and just being able to say you're able to quit all of your obligations through the purchase of these credits, it becomes a numbers game. And I think some strong incentive to decarbonise, noting that there's challenges for many of these businesses. Technology might not be available. That might be a thing that takes a number of years to put in place. But, there's got to be a balance between the flexibility that you need to work through those processes and the reality that this is a huge task to decarbonise this group of entities, and that, we don't have a moment to lose. And so, very serious investigations of opportunities, both near-term, medium-term and long-term, is going to be very, very important. The idea that one of these entities could plausibly do nothing and just buy ACCUs for the next 7 years, that doesn't make any sense.
Maybe I'm too much of an optimist in one sense. So I'm sure there may be some companies that wouldn't care or are privately owned or whatever that might seek to exploit every advantage and just offsetting their way there. But that's not where public or investor expectation is going. Like, we've spent some time talking about greenwashing claims and the I guess the direction of travel in terms of the integrity of claims around reducing emissions and having net zero targets. And the simple fact is, just offsetting the lot is not consistent with what's set out with best practice. I just think these companies are going to be under an awful lot of scrutiny over the next few years, and I would hope that starts to play a much stronger role in the actions that companies would take. Of course, that said, it would have been nice to see a marker laid out in this paper that would suggest that unlimited access is not a forever situation, and that is something that they would also look at ratcheting down over time. I guess this is a pretty significant reform, and you've got to start somewhere. I'm like you. I would have maybe liked to see some guardrails set out for how those things would be ratcheted down over time. But I also think this policy isn't going to be the only thing driving those investment decisions, even purely from a risk management perspective. Like, if you were having to write the business case for how much your offset program is going to cost you out to 2030, like, good luck. I think there's huge uncertainty around what the cost of ACCUs might be. Like, I know they're sort of setting a cap at $75 a tonne, but I don't know how that's really going to match up to what the business case is when you factor in all the other considerations, like what investor expectations are, like public scrutiny.
Well, and like, there's a core thing that investors expect, and that is for companies to not do dumb things that lose money or leave a lot of money on the table. And I think the animating view behind the settings that the government's proposing is that, yes, people are allowed to buy and retire as many ACCUs as they want, but supply and demand, and the fact that entitled emissions keep going down a lot, and supply of ACCUs from the kind of activities that we've been talking about is not going to be able to grow at the same rate, or at least not for long. It means that, like, of course they can't meet all of their needs through ACCUs in practice. It will be far too expensive to try to outbid everybody else for those units, and just economics will compel a greater and greater internal focus over time, with those who genuinely have the most expensive or simply impractical internal options at the back of the line for internal action, and those who have options doing it because it will be much cheaper for them to do that. I mean, so by that argument, like, I am legally allowed to go out and borrow a whole bunch of money and then give it away to people on the street, and the law does not particularly need to forbid me from doing that, because it would be very unwise. And so on this view, well, don't worry. You've set up the market, you've set up the obligation for people to participate in that market, and the demand for abatement, or the reduced supply of the entitlement to abate, and the little elves and sprites of the market will take it from there, don't worry. Now, markets have gone awry from time to time in the past, but there is some compelling logic in there, isn't there? Oh no.
Tennant says, don't stress. She'll be right, Matt.
When you keep coming back to, and this is the reason why you would hope that we come out of this Chubb review process with a functioning, high integrity, transparent, scientifically robust offset scheme. that underpins all of that. If the market is operating, so long as the foundation of that is fundamentally sound, then, I don't know that anyone disagrees that that marketplace has an important role to play in this transition period as those big investments are being made. Perhaps one of the things that's maybe slightly disappointing coming out of that Chubb review, so that, I don't think it will have satisfied all its critics where it's landed. And so I do unfortunately think that, there will continue to be this ongoing conversation of, you're relying on accus, and there'll be some level of skepticism still associated with them. And, I don't think anybody wants that. We all want and need a market that is high integrity and has trust. And, it's not going to serve us well unless we really deal with those underlying issues. So, and that's not just true for the regulated companies in the safeguard mechanism. We haven't even talked about the extraordinary growth in the secondary voluntary market for offsets for companies that are doing this off their own accord to meet net zero commitments that aren't part of the safeguard mechanism as well. There's a lot of demand to satisfy there too.
So for the most vociferous critics of the emerging climate architecture, this is where the Venn diagram of doom crosses over between these two policies, right? Because you've got high-emitting businesses right across the country able to acquit all their obligations by buying an unlimited number of accus, and the accus in this characterisation of the situation aren't doing anything because they don't have integrity. And so literally nothing's happening, just things are getting shuffled around and people are paying money to various other people, and we're not actually reducing our emissions. I don't subscribe to that very pessimistic view of the world. I think there is a totally plausible role for carbon credit units, providing that flexibility across the economy, allowing us to decarbonise at the lowest cost that's possible with the architecture that we currently have. But I do think there is these lingering concerns around the integrity that it's really going to be really important to find a pathway to resolve. Otherwise, this is going to be a enduring critique of the system that's being set up. I'm not sure how that's achieved. Maybe the new governance regime that we were talking about earlier can roll up its sleeves and start to do some of that more detailed work to improve that confidence.
Yeah, so I think that's right. We touched on before the fact that this cake being set up is going to have a role in improving methods, and there's a little bit more separation of work between the CER. This cake will be more independent, project proponent led process for method establishment supported by the department. So it may well be that you get a really bolshy group of people put in place on this cake and want to make some sweeping changes to the methods that are on the table.
Is there a Hogwarts envelope making its way down the chimney of Andrew McIntosh?
Oh, I mean...
Probably not, but you never know.
We'll see. I mean, that would be a very bold choice. I would just acknowledge he's very... having heard him talk about this, he's very passionate, and it is in the camp that of all the people that want to see it be successful and don't want to see this ongoing conversation around question marks over integrity and things like that. I guess the question I've still got, and I'm not sure if the paper gave an answer in terms of who would have the power to do this, but it feels like the cake's ability to make changes are really just forward-looking rather than backwards-looking. So I think that one of the remaining critiques might stand in the sense that if people do believe and haven't been persuaded otherwise that there are credits out there that don't represent real abatement and they're allowed to remain, then I'm not really sure what can be done with that I don't know if any of these reforms to governance would empower the cancellation of credits retrospectively.
I think the view of the regulator that's mentioned in the Chubb report is that there are existing tools available to deal with projects that have not actually met the rules or been compliant with what was asked.
Yeah.
Now, if the rules themselves were not well set up, that probably doesn't help. But it's not like the arsenal is bare.
Yeah, that's right. The CER's role is now much more kind of clearly defined and should and would continue to focus on monitoring projects and regulating projects. So I think maybe the obvious question then to ask is, if there had been issues with certain projects, why hadn't there been action taken? And so I think we then keep circling back around to what's the information that's provided. I think it's really positive that there were really strong recommendations around improved transparency over the scheme, including basically making a lot of the data default to be publicly available, insofar as it doesn't compromise any commercial in confidence information. So I think those will be, again, really important changes. But I think it's sort of all to play for in the next little while. So I'm so distracted by the PowerPoint.
PowerPoint just keeps plaintively chugging away.
Chugging.
Trying to bring us on track. Never stop dreaming, PowerPoint.
Had we done our dash?
There's huge more things that could be discussed, but I think we've talked about a lot.
Well, I mean, maybe we should talk a little bit about next steps in terms of what's happening with all of this, right? The safeguard design paper is, would you believe it, out for consultation at the moment.
There's not much else out for consultation, so people will find it easy to focus on, I'm sure.
Yeah, plenty of time.
Joke.
Jokes.
That was a joke.
Jokes. We're all...
No more things to consult on, please, for a little bit.
We're all very triggered in this conversation.
I'm not laughing.
Well, so those design elements are being consulted on until the end of the month. Tennant, you touched on the fact that legislation was put out there for review. So what are the next steps in... because I think when we talked about this last... there is the need to amend the actual governing legislation, the Carbon Farming Initiatives Act, to provide for, I think, to provide for SMCs to be created, is that right?
Yeah, so the ENGA Act and the Australian National Registry of Emissions Units need to be amended so that safeguard mechanism credits are a thing with a property right that is sufficiently secure that somebody would make a honking big investment on the basis that they might then be able to sell that property right. And notwithstanding there's not going to be a lot of these SMCs for a few years probably, it's still really important to the underpinnings of the scheme. Like those investments, even if they don't get implemented for a few years, will not advance or be triggered until the legal basis is there. So that really matters. And then they've got to rewrite the regs for the safeguard, and those regs have to not be disallowed.
So this is important because the opposition has indicated that they will be voting against this legislation, which brings the Greens and the crossbench more broadly into play. And the Greens, as we know, have a few red lines that they've set out, the most significant being they don't want any more coal or gas extraction projects approved in Australia. And they are unimpressed by the idea that any new projects would have to sort of be enveloped into the overarching emissions reduction task. They just don't want them at all.
Yeah. Now, what's the actual zone for agreement or compromise or whatever. Well, who knows if they know they're not saying on all sides. But yeah, it's something about the treatment of new facilities, and it's something about confidence that businesses in practice won't just do ACCUs forever. And there's probably a few ways to try and come at both of those. But if something isn't done, then it's all going to fall over in a screaming heap, because if the regs are disallowed, if the legislation doesn't pass, that's a huge chunk of Australia's plan to achieve our 2030 target that is in the never until such time as people reconsider, which doesn't sound like a great place to be. And I don't think that's where we will end up, but you couldn't rule it out at this point.
You couldn't rule it out, but then I guess if you look at the way this Parliament has operated in its first year, it has been, pretty collaborative in terms of seeking to pass things through. So, those pathways have been found when it came to the legislation of the economy-wide target, because, there was a lot of the same points, particularly on the green side, that are held really closely. So, I'd like to think that there's zone for compromise in all of this, and it does feel like there's room to move on questions, particularly around the application of ACCUs into the future. Refer our previous conversation.
How's your PowerPoint going, Tina?
It's experiencing Marvin the paranoid android levels of depression at our biological failure to respect its digital suggestions.
Yikes, but I thought that was a good chat.
I agree. You can argue with that. As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, whilst we were all enjoying, and hopefully all our Summerupperers were too, enjoying our well-deserved rest over the New Year break, I was reading up on a lot of the studies that are now starting to become more prominent around the health impacts of gas cooktops in the home. So we're they're just sort of gaining a lot more prominence and currency in the media commentary. And, I think it's been well established for a while that burning gas creates things like nitrogen dioxide and nitric oxide. So we've got NOx floating around homes and all sorts of nasty stuff in terms of particulates. But all the health impacts of having gas cooking in the home are being very prominent. And in the case of the US over the break, it sort of spilled over into the next frontier of the culture wars over there. And
happy days. They were running short of material.
Clearly didn't have enough to be getting on with over there. And it took the form of a response to what I think on any other day, or maybe in an Australian context, would have been a rather innocuous kind of interview with the commissioner at the US Consumer Product Safety Commission, who was talking about the health impacts of gas cooktops and saying that these things can be a hidden hazard. And that, saying in the context of the role that his commission plays and the regulation that's available in the US, that, products that can't be made safe can be banned. And then that was just seized on by the right fringe of the Republican Party in the US, and the claims were, the White House is coming to take your gas cooktop away. Saw people like Ronnie Jackson, who's a congressman from Texas, or Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, coming out and saying, I'll never give up my gas stove. And if the maniacs from the White House come for my stove, they can pry it from my cold, dead hands. We even saw, I think, a chef who has a regular spot on Fox News tape himself to his gas cooktop. So just the hysterics around that.
I would not recommend taping yourself to any cooktop.
Indeed. And you think about some of the high-end kitchens that are converting to induction, it's because they save themselves the safety hazard of having open flames everywhere near the fabric of your clothes and all that. So who knows how long that protest lasted for. I'm sure he wasn't getting any cooking done while he was strapped to his stove. But in any case, I think there's some commentary that started here about how long will it take for that culture war to come to Australian shores. And I thought that was interesting because in a sense that debate's already been happening for some time, albeit in a much more, I would say, measured and more evidence kind of based policy debate.
I hate to disagree with you, Frankie, but we did have in Victoria, we had a bit of a burst of highly emotional conflict on this issue in late 2021. And the cold dead fingers were invoked with respect to gas barbecues, I think.
Yeah.
Which there is no proposal for banning or taking people's barbecues away.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think people feel attached to stoves as a thing that they interact with a lot in a way that they don't have strong feelings about water systems or space heating systems as long as they work.
Yeah, absolutely. Gas cooking is maybe like 4 or 5% of the gas use in a home that has it for heating and hot water too. So it's a minor use, but it is about that emotional connection to it. So also, I think it's entertaining sort of to see what happens in a US context, and it's sort of prompted the government to come out and say, no, we don't have any immediate plans to be banning things. But that's not true in parts of the country where in places like New York they are banning a connection of new buildings to gas for climate purposes, not for health purposes. So I think I just hope we would sort of heed that quality or lack of debate here and strive to have a slightly more sensible conversation here, because those are questions we are currently grappling with, and we do need to navigate a pathway through it, and we do need to take the community on a journey through that too, because it's as much about the hearts and minds and the behaviour change piece in it all. And maybe just as a kind of final thing to say, I just think at some point in the not too distant future, we'll think back on this time and also just think how crazy it was that we once piped highly flammable fossil fuel into the home to have open flames to cook our food. Like, you could just sort of say it's analogous to the way we used to burn coal briquettes, in the home for heating. And that's an absurd notion to anyone in 2023. And I think in not very long we'll be thinking about gas cooktops the way we think about some of those other technologies for which there are better and more efficient alternatives today. So that's my one more thing. Culture war territory, hopefully not in Australia.
All right. Thanks, Frankie. Tennant, what have you got?
So I've got something that is almost, but not quite, completely irrelevant, which is a birthday present that I recently received. And the birthday present is a book called Ignition, An Informal History of Liquid Rocket Propellants by John D. Clark, which If that sounds like an unwelcome present, you would be wrong. This is both delightful in its nerdiness, and it's delightful in its content. It's this guy who was a senior and pioneering chemist in the US in the 50s and 60s and 70s, working on defining the propellants that the military-industrial complex and the aerospace sector and NASA would use. And it's a pretty colourful story for something with this many chemical equations in it. The level of occupational health and safety attention in this context was often not high. A lot of things went kaboom. They were working with, like, some of the less horrifying stuff that they were working with was called red fuming nitric acid as an oxidizer. But the one relevant thing to climate and energy work that I learned in the process of this book is that I had been thinking of liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen rockets as something that had no particular climate change implications, because surely if you're combusting hydrogen and oxygen, you're just making water, and water vapour will condense into rain and everything will be fine. But it turns out that it is not actually maximally efficient to precisely match the hydrogen to the oxygen and combust it all. You want more hydrogen in the exhaust stream to get more specific impulse, and you can find out more about that in the pages of this book. And therefore, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen rocketry is going to be a source of greenhouse gas emissions, because hydrogen, molecular hydrogen in the atmosphere, is a greenhouse gas while it lasts. It's not as potent a greenhouse gas as methane, but it shares some characteristics in terms of it's potent while it lasts and then it breaks down. In the case of hydrogen, it does form eventually water. So there's something a hook for me to hang the relevance of this really nerdy book on. But it's mostly a fun story of people at chemical companies shattering the metal vessels in which unthinkably, horrifyingly toxic chemicals were stored, and those chemicals eating their way through 6 feet of concrete and 3 feet of dirt before they were halted. Good fun from a distance.
Which puts me in mind of a YouTube video that I was watching recently. One of my favourite YouTube channels, Kyrgyzstat, exploring the question of why we don't just, build a bunch of nuclear power stations and shoot all the fuel into space.
Why don't we do that, Luke? That sounds like a great idea.
It does sound like a great idea.
I think we should have a Senate inquiry into whether that might be something that we could explore.
Well, as it turns out, we can skip that because this YouTube video exists. And it explains that we would need literally hundreds of rockets a year to be shooting into space.
Well, that doesn't sound so bad.
Well,
Elon Musk's taking care of that for us.
Except that a significant proportion in the single digits of rockets heading into space just explode either on the launch pad or on the way out of Earth. So we would be committing to showering nuclear waste down onto the Earth on a semi-regular basis, were we to execute on this on the face of it sensible plan.
Well, I think we can make this even less sensible with the dread words Project Orion, but that might be a breadcrumb trail for a future segment.
All right. Very quickly, my one more thing. We did our favourite report award of 2022, which in that episode I think we were calling a papy, but in subsequent Twitter correspondence it got renamed, much to Frankie's relief.
Thank you.
It became a... Does someone want to say?
The Wonky.
Wonkies.
And I'm just trying to think. We need to give credit to the Twitter user...
Rock Wallaby.
Rock Wallaby.
Yeah, came up with the winning byword for the best climate and energy paper of 2022. Anyway, so we reviewed our papers, but then I was interested to see that our friends at Carbon Brief had done their own review of climate papers in 2022 through the lens of what had made the news. They looked at the top 10 papers that got media coverage over the course of that year. I can report that only one of the papers that we read for the pod made it into the top 10. The appropriately clickbaity Climate Endgame, exploring catastrophic climate change scenarios, came in at number 6. So I'm pleased to report that we're not driven by the mainstream media. It confirmed our status as climate report iconoclasts, but when I was looking at our reports versus the things that showed up in the media, I think we're a bit more solutions oriented. So the ones that in this top 10 list veer strongly towards we're all screwed, things are getting bad really, really quickly. Let's see. Number 1, climate change increases cross-species viral transmission risk. Number 2, exceeding 1.5 degrees global warming could trigger multiple climate tipping points. Number 3, Arctic
that was on our list, that one, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah.
The Arctic has warmed nearly 4 times faster than the globe since 1979. And I could go on. None of them are particularly cheery. But this was interesting for me because I didn't even know that we had that bias, but I think it probably reflects our personalities, is that we're spending our time thinking about solutions more than, the degree to which things are running off the rails. But the media is reporting more on the bad things that are happening. So that's just an interesting dynamic that I thought I'd bring to your attention.
Maybe we can lean into this with a campaign online about how the mainstream media don't want you to know about the reports that we will bring to you.
I think you meant to say the lamestream media.
Oh.
Indeed. Reports and soon nutritional supplements. But I do think, Luke, there's a worrying contradiction between your characterisation just now of us as iconoclasts, perhaps as paper hipsters, and your statement way back at the start of this very svelte 45 minutes, don't check your timer, people, episode, that we were the podcast of record. What I might rephrase as the new Dork Times.
New Dork Times.
Which is it, Menzel?
That seems so long ago, Tennant. I can't even remember. It's time to bring this episode.
No, yes,
What?
no. I like
What?
that we're niche, hipster, climate paper nerds. I think we should lean into our extreme nerdery and not try to compete with the lamestream media, as you were.
Well, I think we have not made any effort to compete with them in this fine episode.
Can I finish now?
Yikes.
Oh,
Sorry.
I think we can interrupt you at least 4 more times. It's dynamic.
I'm stopping.
Cue a haunting song by Enya to play over the closing credits of this special extended edition.
That is our show for today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tennant is at
Tennant Reed.
My handle is at Luke Menzel. Although I can reveal I have set up a little outpost on Mastodon. So you can also find me at Luke Menzel at oz.org.au. social, just checking out that neck of the woods where there are a few energy nerds hanging out. If you've got reports you want to put in front of us in this new year of Let Me Sum Up, you can contact us at mailbag@letmesumup.net. You can subscribe to us in your favourite podcast app. There's a big back catalogue of episodes at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. I've learnt my lesson. I'll never make a big speech about, how we need to shorten the episodes again. Which has, I think, resulted...
reverse psychology.
It has resulted in almost certainly the longest episode that we've ever recorded.
But I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I remember us recording for that long when we were only talking about one paper last year. I think we've been more efficient on a per paper basis.
Absolutely. And I think it's very methodologically sound for us to do the thing and then hunt back through the metrics by which we can say we found a significant positive result.
Yes.
We definitely don't want to be defining success ahead of time and then measuring that, because that would be very inconvenient. I'm going to press stop on my recording.